It's just past 10 at night at Royal Birkdale. The grandstands are empty, the leaderboard's gone dark, and out on the far end of the range, one man is still hitting balls, alone, under the glow of a giant screen, hours after everyone else has gone home. When a player breaks a rule by accident, should the punishment still hit as hard as if he'd done it on purpose? Because that's exactly the debate Bryson DeChambeau forced onto this tournament. And by the end of tonight's breakdown, you might land somewhere you didn't expect. If you've got a take already, drop it in the comments. I read everyone, and I'll tell you where I stand later in this video. And if you want to see exactly how this plays out, make sure you're subscribed, because this channel's whole thing is breaking down the moments in sports nobody else explains properly. 2 hours earlier, DeChambeau was in second place, one shot off the lead. By the time he walked off that range, his tournament and his temper had completely unraveled. To understand how, we have to go back to the fifth hole. To most casual fans, Bryson DeChambeau is the guy who turned golf into a physics experiment. Two-time U.S. Open champion. Built his swing around science instead of instinct. Bulked up, changed his equipment, changed the way people think about the sport itself. Love him or hate him, he doesn't play like anyone else or beat outside, and he doesn't back down like anyone else either. This week, that reputation mattered more than usual. Through 36 holes at the Open, DeChambeau was sitting in second place, one shot behind the leader, playing some of the cleanest golf of his season. A 4-under 66 in round 2 had him right in the mix for his first claret jug, the one major title still missing from his resume. For a player who spent years being dismissed as more scientist than golfer, this was the round that could have silenced every critic. He wasn't just chasing a trophy, he was chasing validation. And for most of Friday afternoon, it looked like he was going to get it. Then, midway through his post-round routine, everything changed. It started with a tee shot that never should have caused this much trouble. On the drivable 326-yard par 4 fifth, DeChambeau's drive sailed right and buried itself in tall grass. He hit a provisional, walked forward, and eventually found his original ball sitting in the rough. That's where the trouble began. Broadcast cameras caught him pulling a fairway wood, setting the club head down behind the ball, then swapping it out for an iron before playing his shot. Small movement, barely noticeable in real time. But rules officials reviewing the footage saw something different. A patch of matted down grass, right in his line of play, that hadn't been there before he stepped in. By the time DeChambeau finished his round, officials were already waiting. They didn't hand him a ruling on the spot. Instead, they walked him back out to the fifth hole itself, club in hand, so he could show them exactly how he'd played the shot. Whatever he said out there wasn't going to be quiet, and it wasn't going to be quick. For 10 minutes on that fifth hole, DeChambeau argued his case. Club in hand, visibly frustrated, he tried to walk officials through his exact stance, insisting the grass behind his ball had nothing to do with his swing path. This wasn't a quiet disagreement. Witnesses described it as animated, tense, DeChambeau growing more incredulous with every explanation officials gave him. Eventually, he was heard saying, "I'm not going to play tomorrow," before walking away and getting a ride back toward the clubhouse with the same R&A official who'd just delivered the news he didn't want to hear. Near the scorer's tent, he was overheard calling officials crooks. Meanwhile, the leaderboard sat frozen. DeChambeau's card hadn't been finalized, which meant nobody, not the fans, not the media, not the other players still trying to finish their rounds, knew where the tournament actually stood. 75 minutes passed between DeChambeau walking off 18 and the ruling becoming official. Somewhere in the recorder's office, officials were about to make a call that would turn his bogey into something far worse. When the decision finally came down, it was worse than most people expected. The R&A ruled that DeChambeau had improved his lie, and under the rules, that meant a 2-shot penalty, no matter whether it was intentional or not. That single ruling rewrote his entire scorecard. His bogey on the fifth hole became a triple bogey 7. In the span of one decision, he dropped from solo second place all the way down to a tie for fifth, 3 shots off the lead held by Lucas Herbert. Rules official John Moyer addressed the situation directly afterward, making it clear that intent was never part of the equation. Whether DeChambeau meant to gain an advantage or not, the rule doesn't distinguish between the two. If the grass in his swing path was altered in a way that could help him, the penalty applies, automatically, regardless of what was going on in his head when he did it. That explanation didn't make it any easier to swallow for a player who was one shot off the lead just hours earlier. 3 shots back overnight is a completely different tournament. It's the difference between playing to win and playing to survive the cut line for contention, and it raised a question that would follow DeChambeau for the rest of the week, one that golf fans have been arguing about for years, long before this tournament even started. If this rule is barely enforced on tour, is it fair to enforce it now in a major against one of the biggest names in the sport? The R&A had made their decision. DeChambeau hadn't made his. Quick pause before we get into what he actually did after that ruling, because this is the part of the story most coverage completely skipped over. If you've ever wondered what a professional golfer does in the immediate aftermath of a decision like that, one that just cost him 3 shots in a major championship, stick around. What DeChambeau did over the next few hours tells you more about him than the penalty itself ever could. And if you're the kind of viewer who actually wants the full picture instead of a 15-second clip stripped of context, that's exactly what this channel is built for. Drop a comment with your gut reaction to that ruling so far. Fair enforcement or officials making an example out of a star? I read all of them. Subscribe if you want to see exactly how this night ended for him. Instead of heading straight to his hotel, DeChambeau walked past the entire waiting media pack without saying a word. No statement, no explanation, nothing. He went straight to the practice range. For almost an hour, he stood out there alone, hitting ball after ball in near total darkness, the only light coming from the giant broadcast screen towering over the course. No coach hovering beside him, no cameras rolling up close, no crowd, just him working through whatever he was working through, one swing at a time. Think about that for a second. This is the man who manages DeChambeau's career, his schedule, his commitments. And even he couldn't say with confidence whether one of the biggest names in golf was about to walk away from a major championship over a 2-shot penalty. For a sport that prides itself on composure and tradition, that kind of uncertainty hanging over a major on a Friday night was almost unheard of. Whatever was going through DeChambeau's mind on that range, he wasn't ready to share it with reporters, but just after midnight, he finally did share it. Only not with the people waiting outside the clubhouse. A couple of hours after leaving that range, DeChambeau finally addressed everything, not in front of cameras, not through his manager, but on social media, in his own words, on his own terms. 6 words in that post carry the entire story. I don't agree with it confirms he still believes the penalty was wrong, even hours after officials explained their reasoning. But this fires me up is the part that mattered most, because it directly contradicted every rumor swirling since he'd walked off that range. Whatever he'd told officials in the heat of that confrontation, whatever "I'm not going to play tomorrow" actually meant in the moment, this post made one thing clear. He wasn't walking away. The contrast here is what makes this moment worth sitting with. In public, defiant, determined, framing the penalty as motivation. In private, hours earlier, alone on a dark range with no one around to perform for, working through something that looked a lot less like motivation and a lot more like genuine frustration. Both of those things can be true about the same person on the same night. The composed competitor talked about being fired up for cameras and followers, and the frustrated athlete who needed nearly an hour alone in the dark just to process what had happened to him. That tweet ended the speculation about whether he'd play, but it didn't end the conversation, because while DeChambeau was deciding what to say publicly, the rest of the golf world had already picked sides. Sir Nick Faldo didn't hold back. Speaking on Sky Sports, the 6-time major champion offered a blunt read on the entire situation. He wants to be the center of attention. It's got nothing to do with that, nothing to do with Bryson. This is just a golfer who has put his foot down and moved the grass. That is simply our rule book. The R&A handled it beautifully, handled it factually, and bottom line, it's job done. That split golf fans instantly. One side agreed completely. A rule is a rule, and DeChambeau's reaction, the crooks comment, the late-night range session, all of it looked like theater from a player who thrives on attention. The other side pushed back with a harder question. How often does this rule actually get enforced? Just weeks earlier at the U.S. Open, fans and analysts openly questioned whether Wyndham Clark's practice, swings, and unusual spots during his final round made his own recovery shot easier. No penalty followed, no review, no confrontation on the course. So the real debate was never just about whether DeChambeau broke a rule. It was about whether that rule gets applied the same way to every player, every time, or only when the cameras happen to catch the right angle at the right moment. Golf's rule book is supposed to be identical for everyone who tees it up. Friday night in England raised a much messier question about whether that's actually true in practice. Now, I want you to write next section, but keep in mind, previous section is connected to next connection for better and continuous flow from start to the end. But keep in mind, each connection flow is naturally not randomly. Tell me which section is going, and also word count. Don't mention about next story or next T section or next part or next. Don't use those. So where does that leave this whole situation? On one side, a rule book that doesn't care about intent, applied exactly as written by officials who stood by their decision from start to finish. On the other, a player who still believes even now that the call was wrong, and a sport that's been inconsistent about enforcing this exact rule for years. Was this the R&A protecting the integrity of the game, treating every player the same regardless of their name on the leaderboard? Or were these officials making an example out of the biggest star in the field in a way a lesser-known player might never have faced the same scrutiny for? Drop your verdict in the comments. Fair ruling or a star singled out? And while you're down there, tell me where you're watching from. I read every single comment on these videos, and I am always curious how far this reaches. If breakdowns like this are what you come here for, subscribe, because the next controversy in this sport is never far away.